So a long time ago, some of my colleagues and I sort of developed this pie chart, and actually my colleague Ken Sheldon and I just wrote a paper that kind of is updating kind of our thinking about the pie chart. But let me sort of explain. So the question is sort of what determines happiness? And so the way I like to think about it now is that there's lots of determinants of happiness, but there's sort of three buckets. And one is genetics. I mean, there's lots of good data that there's a genetic influence on happiness. There are behavior genetics studies that show that identical twins are much more similar in their happiness levels than our fraternal twins, which suggests that identical twins, of course, share 100% of their DNA, fraternal twins 50%. So this finding suggests, so lots of findings that say this suggests that there's a genetic component to happiness. There's a study that came out that I just found out about that shows that actually was a molecular genetics study that shows there's 400 places on the genome that are associated with happiness. 400. It's fascinating. Obviously, it's very complicated. So we know the genetic component to happiness doesn't mean that we're fated to kind of be happy or unhappy, based on our genes. Of course, we can sort of change our happiness. We can change our behavior. We might have to just work harder if we're unlucky enough to kind of have a lower sort of set range for happiness. So genetics is one component. And by the way, personality is tied into that because personality is also, of course, partly genetic and is very highly related to happiness. And then our life circumstances, how wealthy we are, what country we live in, how healthy we are, our relationships, are also going to affect our happiness. Generally not as much as we think they will. That number is sort of usually smaller than we think. Of course, if your life circumstances are really bad, if you live in a war zone in Syria, if you are in an abusive relationship, if you're very poor, I mean, that's going to affect your happiness hugely. But once your basic needs are met, sort of improving your life circumstances is going to make you happier, but just sort of not hugely. And so that leaves kind of the third bucket, which is kind of how we behave in our daily life, how we think. And these are our deliberate, intentional activities or behaviors that we actually have some control over, that we have more control over than the genetics or the life circumstances. And that's what my research is focused on, is sort of how do we prompt people to try to change their behavior or their thinking on a daily basis or on a weekly basis to see if that impacts their happiness.